What is it you want, Barry? What do you want? You want the moon? Just say the word and I'll throw a lasso around it and pull it down.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, dying times here.
Come with me if you want to live.
That's it, man. Game over, man. Game over.
The Force will be with you, always.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to 20th Century Geek. I'm your regular host, Scott Weatherly, and today I'm going to be joined once again by the fantastic Julian in our Part 1 retrospective review of Terry Gilliam's thematic Age and Imagination trilogy. Now, I don't know if this is as well known as some other thematic or even just standard trilogies, but it's a really important one in the career of Terry Gilliam. It's a trilogy that looks at the three ages of man: childhood, middle age or adulthood, and old age. And the films we are going to be covering in this retrospective are Time Bandits, Brazil, and The Adventures of Baron Munchausen. So all three films released during the 80s, they are different interpretations on how imagination affects age. So sit back and enjoy our discussion as we start off talking about an overview of Terry Gilliam, and we get straight into Time Bandits. I'll pass you over to me and Julian. Julian, welcome back on the show.
It's my pleasure to be here, Scott.
As always, it's going to be a good conversation, I think, today. We were talking about Terry Gilliam and his thematic trilogy of films, which I think I've heard referred to as his Age trilogy or his Imagination trilogy. And that's Time Bandits, Brazil, and The Adventures of Baron Munchausen. So before we start, though, what was sort of your introduction to Terry Gilliam, and what's your thoughts on him as a director?
Well, I like him. I think that my introduction would have been seeing, exactly these films when I was relatively young. I mean, I think maybe I was, in high school or something like that. And, I think much along the lines of, Tim Burton films and David Lynch films, I really craved anything that was different. And so, Gilliam was a, wonderful director and one of my favorites because his films were different and they had that style, they had that look. And I think at the time, and I've talked about this before, that sort of, I felt I was an outsider and I felt a lot of sort of social repression. I mean, the 80s and the early 90s were a very repressed time over here. And I think that, I identified with them for their whimsy and their zaniness. What about you?
Yeah, no, it's similar. I mean, in the 90s, I think in the early 90s, I think my first introduction, unknowingly, actually was The Adventures of Baron Munchausen. Was when someone identified him to me as a director. And then later, it was sort of 12 Monkeys in the mid-90s that sort of it struck home. I was like, oh yeah, I really like this guy. I sought out some of his other stuff. And that's when I watched sort of Brazil and Time Bandits. And it was only then I realised that he was connected with Monty Python, which really, when you watch the films, you should really make that connection. But it dawned on me after I watched a couple of the films. I was like, oh my god, there is that. And then I learnt the connection with the Monty Python, and having watched Monty Python on TV and stuff, it was it seemed more cool. I was like, oh god, this guy, there's this British comedy and it's gone to this, and granted he's American, but it was out of that, and it had that sort of humour and that sort of nonsense, sort of styling that I really enjoyed. That I felt I was sort of enjoying something that other people didn't quite get.
Yeah, I think it was similar for me. Although for me, I did not really watch all of Python until later because Python just was never played and was never available in the States. And back then, we didn't have streaming or anything like that. So Python was sort of elusive. I mean, Python was this kind of thing that as an American you saw clips of your whole life, but you never saw a full episode of. And that really built Python up as, this amazing offbeat thing that when I finally saw it and sort of forced myself to watch all the way through it, I was rather let down.
Yeah.
But I knew, wasn't Gilliam the only Python member who was not born in Britain?
Yes. Yeah, all the others are sort of British, sort of came up through the comedy ranks, and sort of, he's the lone American in the crew.
Yeah, and I remember 12 Monkeys was another sort of, I love 12 Monkeys. I love the French original, and I think that was another kind of like watershed where instead of being sort of like the zany director who had made these oddball movies that I like, he was, had made a movie that everyone had to have seen in the year it came out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think like 12 Monkeys is like his. It's like his mainstream breakthrough, isn't it? Really, so I think it's the one film. If you were to sort of mention Terry Gilliam, I think the majority of people would know 12 Monkeys over probably, the rest of his sort of filmography, really.
Mm-hmm. I think that's true. Although I think that if there's a second one, it's Fear and Loathing, which sort of more people know about than have seen. But at least over here, I mean, everybody is nobody really knows who directed it, but everybody knows that film.
Yeah.
At least in film circles or interesting people circles.
That's another interesting one that I remember. I've watched that film, and I went and read the book, and I think it's one of those that I watched it. I can't remember what year the film came out. I mean, that late 90s, early 2000s. I think
late 90s.
Yeah, because I remember I was at university when I read the book, so like between 2000 and 2003. And I remember thinking then that like it's cool and I liked it and it's interesting, but there's a definite it's an insight into Americana that I didn't quite have. So I think sometimes I felt slightly detached from the book because I couldn't. There were certain elements I didn't get, but I think maybe I should revisit that. But the film itself is fantastic. It's that thing of almost unfilmable, but he finds a way to do it with his the absurdness of it all.
Oh yeah, quite. Yeah, and I think that sort of stood the test of time. And it obviously lends itself to Gilliam and to imaginary sequences and all of this. As does 12 Monkeys. Although 12 Monkeys is more, obviously it's not a linear narrative, but there's less doubt what's real and what isn't than most of his films. And I think that, I don't know. I mean, do you find that you like Gilliam reined in, or do you want Gilliam to be Gilliam?
I think I prefer. Having watched these and some of the others, I think I actually it depends because it's the same with most directors. I think when Gilliam's being Gilliam, you get something which is you can get gold. It can be great, but then it's still sort of like it can be overly long or it can be a little bit. There's elements that are frustrating, and sometimes I think you need an honest filter to some of these creative types that sort of says, I really see what your vision is, however you can tighten it up by doing this, this and this, or not doing this for that matter.
Right.
And I sometimes think seeing them reined in, you get a much tighter story. And I think 12 Monkeys is a good example of that.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I mean, and I do sort of adore that film, and I find it holds up. I watched for the first time in preparation for this podcast The Man Who Killed Don Quixote, and I was quite taken with it. And
is that his latest one?
Yeah, it's from just last year, from 2018.
Yeah, I can't get it over here.
Oh, well, I was quite taken with it, and and I thought it may well be one of his better films. I sort of didn't think all that much of the Imaginarium of Dr. Parnassus, but what I thought was interesting about Quixote was that he had taken an earlier version of it, the one that was aborted, was going to involve time travel and all of this stuff, and the final product does not have those elements. It's been reconfigured, and so much of what I love about it is the ways in which it's been reconfigured and the ways in which it still has fantastic sequences and sort of fantasy sequences and sequences where people are in costume in big crowds for reasons in plot that you go with or you don't, and it has a little bit of I keep thinking of Fellini every time I watch Gilliam, but it has those elements, but it has a much more controlled plot, and I think it's interesting that when he had the opportunity to sort of revise something for 20 years, it wound up having a more tightly controlled plot than the stuff. Then it has fewer of those things that irritate me. Where I think that I know it's a fantasy film, but this doesn't quite make sense or resonate.
Yeah, I get a feeling with some of the with Gilliam as well. He has a clear vision and he runs at it, and he's obviously going to create that vision. And I think he has a level of stubbornness. But I also, from what I've in some of the research I've done, and also so when you watch things, it's clear that on set he may have an idea and then go, "I'm going to film all this as well." We've got the setup and I've got the people. Right, I've just had this idea and we're going to do this, and you can see that sort of a disjointed nature to things at times, where they've tried to either shoehorn an idea in or things go off on a tangent that I think harkens back to that sort of being a part of the Monty Python writing crew.
Yeah. Well, and I know that the only reference I could find to Fellini was that a version of Brazil was going to be named 1984 and a half in reference to 8 and a half. But that's sort of my take on Fellini is that almost every scene is amazing, memorable, stunning, brilliant. But in most of his films, not all, but in most of them, none of those scenes really have anything to do with one another.
Yes. Yeah.
Maybe a character wanders from one scene into the next, and that's about it. And each one of them is crazy and amazing, but and I think that there's something about that that's in Gilliam too. That you're probably right. I mean, traces back to Python and the sort of whimsical comedy and absurdist comedy that Python really pioneered.
Well, I think he gets better, and I think, like you say, he gets tighter as he's got on. And there are films of Gilliam's that I like, and I can watch again and again and again. I can watch, and you can take more from them, and they can be read in different ways depending on what mood you're in or what age you are, and all those kinds of things. And then I think there are ones, I think, is it called Tideland? Yeah. Which I watched once, and I don't think I don't know, it left me in a way that I was like, I don't ever want to revisit that.
Yeah, I felt the same way about that.
Yeah, so that's what I'm saying. So I think, he has these flights of fancy, and he has these things, and then he'll do something a little bit out of left field where, like you say, it's not quite what you'd expect from him. But he has got better and better over the years. And I have to respect that he's maintained a vision. Like, he's never, there's always rumours he's going to be the person to do this film or that film or whatever, but he's never, I don't want to say sold out, because that's the wrong term, but he's never gone completely mainstream, do you know what I mean? He's never gone fully commercial to make it's always on his terms, for better or worse.
Right. And he does have these, sort of infamous fights with the studios over the cuts of the film. And in fact, apparently the documentary that was made about the aborted attempt with the Johnny Depp version of Don Quixote, the only reason why he had a documentary crew there is that he routinely has documentarians on set in order to document what he was doing for when he runs into problems with the studio, or in order to show, like, that was not my vision, they changed this.
Yeah, it's so clear that he's come across that so often. That, like you say, it's clearly a snag for him. A bugbear for him. I mean, it was, for example, the version of Brazil that I watched is like 136 minutes long, but there's a theatrical cut. It's 1 hour 40. That was studio mandated.
I've never seen. You've never seen that.
Yeah, well, it didn't do well because I'm pretty sure it probably didn't make any sense.
Right. Well, there are some people who think the finished movie doesn't make any sense, but I can only imagine. It's like cutting David Lynch's Dune down to 2 hours or something. It cannot make sense.
No, and that's why I think sometimes you've got to see, the whole vision to sort of fully understand where he's trying to get to. And I really would like to see his Don Quixote film, and it kept getting cancelled and pushed back, and because of issues he had at Cannes, it hasn't got a European release and all this other stuff. So I really do want to track it down at some point.
Yeah, I was surprisingly pleased with it, but I agree with you that he sort of aged well. He seems to be very curmudgeon-y, and he's been talking about how sort of every movie could be his last movie for a decade now, and I know that was part of the Imaginarium of Dr. Parnassus, in which Heath Ledger died, and he was sort of thinking about his own mortality, and then one of his lead actors died.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, I don't know. So, and that's the thing. I think you can. He's one of those directors again that I think, like you say, you can track real life events in parallel with the productions of his films, can't you? You can sort of see how those things impact, because, like you say, with the Imaginarium of Dr. Parnassus, for many others that would have been it. Okay, Heath Ledger has passed, so that's going to close down that film, or they'll completely reboot it or do whatever they're going to do with it. But no, I'm going to push on, and I'm going to do this and this, and I'm going to change direction and do these things. And I'm always impressed that he has the imagination and the verve to keep pushing on these things.
Yeah, indeed. And the fact that he kept coming back to Quixote is sort of amazing. And he's sort of persevered as a director despite that, and Heath Ledger dying and other things that have happened to him, including financing problems on movie after movie. The other thing that's worth noting, as we, still kind of wrap up the general impressions, is he seems like a really nice guy.
Yeah.
I don't expect that of an artist. I don't need my writers and artists to be nice guys, but he seems like the kind of person who will stubbornly stick to his vision, but that he legitimately likes his actors, legitimately loves stories and loves film, and donates to charity and cares about politics, and certainly struggles in a sort of corporate filmmaking environment in which you need to raise $40 million to make one of these movies. But he does seem like a legitimately nice guy. Maybe difficult to deal with if I were in charge of financing or something, but but other than that, I mean, and it's refreshing to see. I mean, that does strike me as sort of very British. The way in which he's nice, the way in which he seems to actually care about people and politics, it does strike me as sort of in line with some other British creators and creative types who I've seen.
Yeah, no, I agree. Actually, I think whenever I've seen him in interviews and stuff, like you said, the grumpy sort of granddad sort of comes across, but it's with a level of integrity and honesty that I really respect. Like, he does have opinions on things, both artistic, culturally, and politically, and he's willing to voice those. But it's never sort of in an aggressive way or a sort of a derogatory way. And like I say, I respect that he keeps to his visions. I think that's always been. He's a bit to me. He's almost like a more authentic version of a director than Tarantino. It is Tarantino film, and he does his thing, and he'll fit into the pop culture mold more. And Gilliam's that same thing to me. That it's a Gilliam film.
Oh yeah.
And
well, both.
I was saying he'll do those films, but he doesn't want to disrespect other people's films. It's never done to make anyone else look bad or to question things, but he's just doing his thing, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think both Tarantino and Gilliam are people who you can probably identify the director based on a 3-minute clip, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Just the way it's shot, you know that's a Gilliam film. But with Tarantino, there's no illusion that Tarantino would be a fun guy to hang out with, but there's no illusion that he's a nice guy in the way that Gilliam is.
No, true. So let's move on to the three films. So this is I couldn't find it when it was ever acknowledged that this was an intended trilogy. I think it's more happenstance and lucky coincidence. But this is sort of the age and imagination thematic trilogy. So the idea being that each film represents one of the stages of man and their views on imagination, or their sort of the imagination of that stage. So we have Time Bandits, taken from the child's perspective. Brazil, focusing on that sort of the corporate middle-aged perspective. And then the Adventures of Baron Munchausen, looking at that sort of the sort of final stages of life and looking back on what you have achieved, whether it's true or not, in life. Mm-hmm. So they're the three films we're going to talk about. So I suppose let's start with the kids and we'll work the way through. So Time Bandits is from 1981, written by Terry Gilliam and with Michael Palin in tow. So, what are your first thoughts on on Time Bandits?
Well, I watched these three films with a friend of mine who's sort of my generation, and sort of both of us thought, especially with Time Bandits, that these were all films that we sort of had grown up liking, and for much of the reason that I described. And especially with Time Bandits, I think both of us had the impression, why did I like this? I don't know. I thought Brazil aged a lot better. I thought Time Bandits, it came off, a lot of what it was trying to do seemed like its whimsy and charm seemed to me like what I liked as a kid was sort of what I liked about Goonies. This kid kind of thrust into this adventure, and I think that, some sequences are just simply awful. I mean, the Robin Hood sequence is terrible, right?
Yeah.
I think John Cleese plays Robin Hood. And I thought, this has nothing to say about Robin Hood. This is not funny. And I think that the Satan stuff, why why are there angels who are midgets who, I know it's imagination and do whatever you want. I like the math, right? I mean, there's stuff that I like. Certainly, like, the sets are wonderful, and it certainly has a sense of whimsy. But I don't understand why these angels have, they're just like, well, we're sick working in this department we've been demoted to, so let's start robbing people of their material possessions. I don't know why that's happening. I don't know why this whole, like, Satan plot stuff is going on, or why God can't just make another map. I don't understand that stuff. What were your impressions, if I haven't been too strong?
No, it's true. I think it's one of those films. Again, watching it this time, with a more of a critical eye to look into, discuss it, you do notice flaws. When you look at it in that way, and I think this was the first time I did. I sort of thought, this feels like a sketch show with a loose connection for each bit. So it's like, okay, they've come up with an excuse for them to travel through time, and then each time's going to be a sketch, and then they're going to do this, and then they're going to do that. And it feels incredibly sort of bitty. But the thing that sort of struck me more than anything this time is the shifts in tone. That I found really sort of, like I say, I'm quite forgiving of, like I say, the idea of having the little people as sort of workers in heaven. I was like, yeah, okay, I can go with that. They're creating this sort of mythology of clearly something that Terry Gilliam has got an issue with is the corporate world.
Yeah.
So heaven, in creation is basically a corporate entity that you've got tiers and departments, and people have got people working shrubbery. And that thing obviously comes up again and again and again, that idea of the corporate world or their corporate stooge. So I was quite fine with that. I thought, okay, that's fine, I'm with it. But it's the fact that they go to revolutionary France, you get Napoleon Bonaparte, and the tone is, comedic, but you've got that sort of not a darker edge, but you've got a realistic element in that. Okay, it's a destroyed castle, but you've got Ian Holm playing Napoleon as a sort of a slightly daft version, obsessed with his height. He starts reeling off other people that are shorter than him.
Yeah.
And then he likes to watch comedy on stage, and you think, okay, I'm fine with that. And then they shift to another thing, and then like I say, they have the almost Prince Charles impression that John Cleese gives of Robin Hood. And then you go to ancient Greece with Sean Connery's Agamemnon, and it's a completely different film.
Yeah, that's a good point. Those shifts in tone. I like the sort of bureaucratic heaven stuff. I don't mind that. I'm more bothered by, like, why is Satan obsessed with technology? This seems very strange. And of course, this hasn't dated well because, of course, we all have, computers in our pockets, the likes of which were never imagined at the time the film was made. I did take some umbrage at the Napoleon sequence, where I thought, certainly, there can be a million criticisms of Napoleon, but Napoleon was part of, like Cromwell, part of, the rise of a sort of middle-class meritocracy where somebody could actually be a good general because they were a good general and not because, they had been appointed because they were somebody's son. And the idea that Napoleon, of all people, would be incompetent and utterly daft. I mean, he's interested in the stage show, but, I mean, he seems so bourgeois in his values. He likes a silly puppet show and likes when they hit each other. And it just, it didn't strike me as having anything to say. I think you're right about those shifts in tone, that, the Agamemnon sequence is like, this can't be from the same film. I did like that sequence more, although, I found myself thinking, like, yeah, I don't think Agamemnon fought a minotaur. I don't know why you decided to put that in.
Well, again, this is one of the things that sort of again runs. There are sort of themes that I sort of find running through this is, with these characters, that I think that it doesn't have anything to say, like you say, as a satire on anything that's happening at the time or anything else. But I honestly think that Terry Gilliam has got an issue with any figure of authority that tries to implement an element of something like organisation and control.
Yeah.
So you see it with Napoleon. He takes the mickey out of Napoleon as being, like you say, almost incompetent, which is incredibly odd, as you say, because he led this army and conquered most of Europe. However, then he shows Agamemnon as a warrior that actually wants to sort of, we're going to have a celebration about art and craft and as a serious leader. And so I always took it as, like I say, that any person in this that's going to show, like I say, that desire to implement a regime of control, he's going to poke fun at them for no other reason that he doesn't like it. And I think that's always been that in my reading of that. It sort of comes to thing about Satan as well. So the evil one, as they refer to him, is he has this obsession with technology, and again, it's that thing of it almost feels easy. This thing coming from the sort of the 70s and the 80s of the sort of the evil technology, or it's going to turn on us, or it's going to be consumerism. So the film starts with the mum and dad watching a game show, and they can win with like a slow cooker or a toaster or something, and then there's this constant thing then about technology or about sort of like it's not even good technology, it's consumer technology, white goods, and it seems to poke fun at that, but it doesn't seem to be a satire in any way of saying it's bad, it's making us lazy, it's making us bad parents, because they never get to that.
Right. No, I think that's very aptly said. I mean, I think the beginnings of sort of like You Bet Your Life game show, I quite like. And it reminds me of sort of RoboCop or something. And then the sort of having the household goods. I mean, even when there's the fire at the end, right? She's worried about her household products.
Yeah.
I mean, it does strike me, there's a sort of like Tim Burton sort of satire of the 50s, although obviously this is later, but that same sort of like idea that these are somehow going to improve our life to the point where we're more interested in our dishwasher than our kids. But as you say, it doesn't really go anywhere. I mean, and to the same extent, I mean, I found myself thinking like I don't understand anyone's motivation in this movie. Mm-hmm. I don't understand the evil one's motivation. Mm-hmm. I don't really understand God. I don't understand the angels who, are just like, screw this, let's rob people. Yeah. I don't understand the kid. Like, he wants to stay with Agamemnon. He's like, I've been appointed your heir. So he never misses his dad. There's no single scene in which he misses his dad. At the beginning, he seems as if he thinks he's going to go home eventually. And then once he's with Agamemnon, he's like, I'm quite happy here. Don't rescue me. Which, I think that's one of the more successful sequences. But, and there's certainly things that I like. I mean, I like the magic show with, the sort of teleportation door disappearing. But I don't really understand the kid's motivation or any of these characters.
Well, I think it's one of those films that if you read it in... The other way that I tried to read this film was... Did this... Because you can read this as like, none of this happened.
Yeah.
So if you read it, so in that first section of the film, you got the You Bet Your Life game show, And the parents are fixed to the TV. They're eating like a microwave meal, and he's sat at the back reading a book, and he's actually reading about ancient Greece in the book. And you also see that in his room he's got another book about Robin Hood. So he's, the kids, they're trying to lay those hints that all these ideas are there. And to me, I think there's this sort of, it's never set up. That's the problem with this that I found again, was nothing is set up very well. So you're just supposed to assume from this one small section that he has a poor relationship with his parents. But again, it's sort of like you only see them over dinner twice. And in that, it's sort of like, oh, I don't want to eat this. And they're like, well, don't. It's not. They don't seem like terrible parents. They're not abusing him. They don't seem to be ignoring him. They're trying to engage with him at a few points. And then, but then it never expressly says, like, there's no Chekhov's gun sort of situation for Agamemnon or anything like that, where he's like, he does mention something out of the book, but there's nothing explicitly where he says, like, I wish I never lived here, sort of thing. And I know I don't want it that I don't want it to be that explicit, but it's not even really hinted at, to be perfectly honest. So I find that if you take it all as a dream, there's elements of hero worship. Like he's supposed to be looking for that perfect father figure that he finds in Agamemnon, and that sort of like that simple life. I don't think that explains the Robin Hood scenario. That seems to me like a leftover Monty Python sketch. But it maybe feeds into that dream logic of the whole situation, where things are just sort of like are conflicting and contradictory in their own sort of environments.
Well, I think I agree with all of this. I mean, I think that your point is well made about sort of how this can all be a dream, and I kept thinking of Wizard of Oz, and I think that there's a level at which this movie wants to be a sort of madcap 80s version of Wizard of Oz. But in Wizard of Oz, everything feels, as silly and madcap as that movie can be, everything feels as if it is psychologically resonant, as you say, right? Like, these are other father figures, or, this is escapism is positioned as wanting to escape this boring life and, your family and all of this. And the point is there's no place like home.
Yeah.
None of those layers really are there in this version. And I think also you make a good point about like feeling as if those elements are sort of there in it, like a Monty Python sketch. And I found myself thinking, this is a very good, if you think of the movie as like a blueprint for a bigger version of it, right? I don't know, I rarely watch movies and think that they should be remade. I certainly felt that about this. I thought, like, there are great ideas here. This would be fantastic if you tighten these things up and, maybe made a few changes. But the kernel of the story here is great, right? I mean, the idea of these episodic adventures through time that are just sort of, madcap and silly, with this kid character, with these Wizard of Oz elements in the framing sequence, I think it's great. I think that's a fantastic idea. And they talked about, like, rebooting it as a series or something. I don't know if that's serious, but I do feel as if there's enough good there that I want those elements to be stronger, and the weaving between those episodes or these aspects of the movie to be stronger.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think there's enough there to go at, and like I say, it's one of those things again that if it went through a stronger filter and it had been given a bit more time to gestate, a bit like we said with, say, Don Quixote, then I think it would be stronger. Again, if you take this as dream logic, then you can probably forgive more. But there are still elements that bothers me. There's like you say, that so the whole sort of the Robin Hood thing aside, which I think, like I say, wouldn't have felt out of place in Monty Python. You know, a sort of a Robin Hood playing as a royal, sort of doing a royal dignitary kind of thing, and his merry men being a bunch of like real bandits. It's if you take that as a sketch, it's absurd enough that I find it funny, but it feels so out of place in the film. But the other thing I find bizarre is they then go through history, and history seems to have these fantasy elements keep popping up. Like you say, he fights a minotaur, which is it a bloke with a bull's head on? I don't know. And then they go to the Titanic, and they all the sort of the little people then have tuxedos, and no one questions it. And I'm a bit like, oh, I know it's supposed to be a comedy, and that's okay. I'm going to let it slide. But then they go to the land of legend, and it's just sort of, you get the ogre, and it flips into a different film again, and I'm just like, oh, okay, now I've got to keep up with this again.
Yeah, no, that's quite true, especially the sort of like land of legend. I mean, some of the desert photography is makes a big impression on me, and I really enjoy. But the land of legend is like, wait a minute, I thought we were traveling through time. Where is this place, and what is the land of legend? I mean, I get that the evil one has to live somewhere, but where exactly is this? I mean, I guess they have this map of the universe, and as you say, it's like, well, is this a universe in which there is the Minotaur? But one of my problems with the dream logic aspect of it is that I don't know, and this is true of one of the things that irritates me about Gilliam's film, is that sometimes I'm not sure that element works within the sort of like framing sequence that's supposed to be reality. So at the end, the boy is back in his room, and there's a fire, and a fireman kind of wakes him up, and it's sort of linked thematically by smoke, and the fireman pulls him out of the house, and so you think, oh, maybe this has all been a dream. But then the fireman winks at him as he drives away.
Well, worse than that, the fireman winks at him after his parents have just been blown up in reality by a chunk of pure evil.
Yes, I forgot about that. Yeah, and you're just supposed to, like, what am I left with at the end of this movie? I think I said to the person I was watching it with, like, his parents are dead.
Yeah.
What is the next scene of this movie?
Yeah.
Like, just like, Oliver Twist, meet the Time Bandits or something, or what have you done?
And I think, there are things you can take from it that, God is an uncaring bureaucrat who doesn't really care about people. He's the whole point of the film is he was testing out pure evil as a concept, and you sort of think, okay, that makes sense. So when it all happens, he just wanders off and he returns the kid to his home, and there just happens to have been a chunk that they've missed. But like I said, there's no follow up to that. There's no resolution. And I read in looking into these films and that, there was people that do say, oh, I know it's supposed to be, it's an open ending, and it's sort of, you're supposed to read into it what you will and all this other stuff. And I'm like, well, yeah, but you're not really given. Even there are times when you can go, well, that's what the director intended, and this is how I read it. I don't know what I'm supposed to take from that ending, and that's the problem.
I think, Scott, you've helped me to understand this movie better. I think that the killing of the parents is just a kind of Python sketch bit, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and it is set up. I mean, you see very obviously that they've missed this chunk of evil. The idea that I'm not really sure how that gets into the quote-unquote real world, or, is transported back home, but it's, in the sort of microwave or oven or whatever that device is. Yeah, I mean, it's just like, well, wouldn't it be funny if the parents touched it and blew up at the end? And there seems to be no concern for that might be completely traumatizing, and what is this kid going to do next?
Yeah, that's the thing. I think when you watch a sketch show, like an episode of Monty Python, there are sketches that do that they just abruptly end, or they have that absurdist finish punchline, and you just sort of you roll with it, and you either find it funny or you don't. But it's fine in a sketch show because they are literally of no consequence. You roll on to the next one, and it's sort of you might find the next one funny. The idea for a film is supposed to be, at least for the most part, a closed narrative. That you get to the end and you can be left with a hook, you can be left with something, but this is just blown open. It's just sort of there's just yeah. Well,
I was thinking imagine a sort of much more Munchausen sequel in which he has grown up in an orphanage and has sort of had this horrible life, but he remembers these adventures from childhood that everyone thinks he's made up. Yeah, I mean, I guess I find the wink at the end alarming instead of clever. I mean, I get that maybe that's God in disguise, but if you carry enough the wink at the kid, to sort of tell him, like, oh, this is all part of a plan, it's all going to be all right. It's not going to be all right. Why wouldn't you carry enough to prevent his parents from being blown up? I don't know. But, I mean, I guess it makes sense as, a sort of almost as a, more of a Python movie. And it was made between, I guess, Life of Brian and, what is the last one?
Holy Grail. Yeah, you got Holy Grail, Life of Brian, and then now for something completely different.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I mean, they're still making Python movies.
Yeah.
And at the time, so I mean, I guess I can understand it almost as like, there was that kind of like split off from Python that Gilliam used, a lot of fellow Python actors and writers, and that kind of dissipated and then stopped. Or, they'd come back in, but clearly at that point he was his own director. And at this point, clearly he's not yet, and he's kind of doing his own thing, but it's still kind of half a Python movie.
Yeah, and I think that's the way to see it, isn't it? This is very much this has got to be seen through a Python filter, and you could probably put this next to Search for the Holy Grail.
Right.
In that sense of the absurdistness of it and the ending, and that film is supposed to be a medieval, epic comedy, absurdist comedy, but it ends with them being arrested by the police, as sort of almost as cosplayers, kind of historical reenactors, and it feels very similar in that tone of like, and there's going to be a shift left, and then we're going to do another shift, and then we're going to do another shift, and you sort of, it's a little bit breakneck, and you've sort of got to keep up with it really to try and, if you're going to appreciate it. And I understand why people do like this film, but again, I think you can say, oh, it's just childish imagination, and that's what it's supposed to be. That there's that dream logic. However, as you say, I think that's almost now trying to be used to sort of paper over obvious flaws in it.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair, and I do think that, like, I mean, this gets into the wider question of sort of imagination, and which is obviously very important to Gilliam, and and I respect that, but I think that. When I was a child or an adolescent, this meant something very different than it does to me now. And I I think that, like even the phrase dream logic implies that there is a logic here.
Yeah.
It might not be, it might be sideways to our, rational logic, and I'm fine with that. But you have these discussions, especially about movies or comics or art, where, especially since Time Bandits, where you say, like, well, why does Superman do this? And somebody says, what are you talking about? It's a comic or a movie about a guy who flies from an alien planet. What about that this is a fantasy do you not get? And, of course, that's a very unsatisfactory and unfair thing to say, because there are rules. I mean, you think of magic, right? I mean, it's very important if you're doing magic, which is, sort of clearly fantasy, that there are rules, right?
Mm-hmm.
That, if Harry Potter can travel in time, why doesn't he in the other books or movies,
yes.
right? That's a perfectly legitimate thing to say. And if you, as a member of the audience, think, I can go with the magic bit, I can go with, Quidditch and flying around on a broom, and, I understand that's baked into how this universe works. But I don't understand within the internal laws of this universe why, somebody isn't doing X, Y, or Z. And that becomes a problem. So I think, one, about how maybe when I was younger, I didn't have that same sense, and I was just charmed by the whimsy and the imagination of it in a way that now, as an older man, I want the logic part of the dream to be there. And then I think about, about the time in which we're in which science is questioned, experts are questioned, logic is questioned, and I certainly, obviously, Gilliam is on the left, and he's not, he's made anti-fascist movies. What you pointed out about Napoleon is, if anything, he's knee-jerk anti-authoritarian. But this same sort of, doubting of what is reality, unbridled imagination strikes me as something that, when there isn't a logic to it, can be dangerous.
No, I agree. I agree that, like you say, the internal logic or the internal rules have to be consistent. Like you say, I'm willing to give a MacGuffin. I'm willing to give that sort of one or two things, and you can go, okay, I'm going to accept that in this universe this happens. I'm going to accept in this universe that happens. But you've still got to follow a certain rules of physics, or you've got to follow certain rules of logic in order for these things to work. Otherwise, like you say, it just starts to fall apart, and anything can happen, and you're like, okay, well, if that's the case, then nothing has consequence.
Right.
And
that's fine. I mean, you can do a sort of Dadaist sort of wild movie, and I don't mind a movie going off the track, but it seems as if this doesn't. I mean, it doesn't go so completely off the tracks that I get that feeling of sort of, whatever, this is crazy, and all right, another left turn. I mean, it does seem as if the back to reality, sort of like Wizard of Oz ending, with the fire, but then you've got the piece of evil and, the fireman winking, that does seem to imply we're reaching for this narrative consistency that, the movie can't really quite do.
Yeah. No, I agree. So, so we've started the trilogy, and I think both of us feel that sort of Time Bandits, I don't want to say it's a kid's film, but it definitely I think you can definitely appreciate it younger.
Yeah, agreed.
Which is sort of works really for what the thematic trilogy really is. Because then we move on to Brazil. Okay, so we're going to put a pin in it right there. As I said, we've had our overview of Terry Gilliam, and now we've talked about Time Bandits. So before we get on to the next two films, we're going to take a break, because the next one is a doozy. It's a bit of a big one, and we're going to be getting deep into Brazil and the adventures of Baron Munchausen before we sort of give our final thoughts on this trilogy. But I hope you've enjoyed this first part of the Terry Gilliam Age and Imagination thematic trilogy retrospective. Please let us know what you think. Is this something that you're aware of? Do you have thoughts on the film Time Bandits, Brazil, or the adventures of Baron Munchausen? I'd really like to know. Reach out and tell us. Contact me on email, 20thCenturyGeek@gmail.com, on social media, on Twitter, Facebook, all under 20th Century Geek. That's at 20th, 20th Century Geek. Love to talk to people about all the topics, or any films or things you think we should be talking about. Also, don't forget, we have got a Patreon page. We're always happy to receive any donations and any contributions, but we have got other podcasts that are released for the different tiers. For $4 a month, you get our eternal thanks. Every couple of weeks, you will get a new episode of Is It Really That Bad? A show looking at films that have a particularly bad reputation and trying to reanalyze them to see if they are as bad as people say. And at the $5 and above level, you'll be getting a monthly podcast in which I spend some time with my wife watching pop culture shows that she has no idea about and recording her reactions. So that's some great fun there. Other than that, if you want to help to the research of the show, 20th Century Geek has got a Amazon wish list. So please go check that out. We love second-hand books in 20th Century Tower. So if you want to help and support us that way, that is also greatly, greatly appreciated. But more than that, if you just want to go on iTunes or any other podcast catcher and just give us a review. If you like the show, give us a 5-star review. I will happily read those out on the show, and I really appreciate them. It helps us get up in the rankings, and it makes people more aware of us, which is also fantastic. So, have a good couple of weeks until the next show, and in the next one, we'll be covering the rest of the Terry Gilliam Imagination and Age thematic trilogy. I'll see you next time.